Okay, I think we're going to start, if that's okay. So, thank you all for coming on this chilly night. It's great to see such an amazing turnout for an amazing book. My name is Bruno Bostiels. I'm a Dean of Humanities, and it's a real honor for me to present panelists for tonight who will present and celebrate this book. And then serve as moderator during the Q&A at the end. So let me briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak, and then I will pass it on to them. We will begin with Joanna Stalnaker, who will say a few words about the book itself. She's a professor of French at Columbia here. Her work on the French Enlightenment lies at the intersection of literature, philosophy, and the history of ideas. Her research interests include women writers, death and last works, and the theory and practice of description. She is the author of a prize-winning first book, The Unfinished Enlightenment, Description in the Age of the Encyclopedia from Cornell, and her new book, which we are here to celebrate, The Rest is Silence, Enlightenment Philosophers Facing Death, which came out with Yale University Press this year, is a moving, intimate portrait of the Enlightenment philosophers, or perhaps in some cases anti-philosophers, notably a brilliant and unjustly neglected woman, about whom you will hear more, as they were facing death. It presents us with a fresh and completely original outlook on the Enlightenment, less concerned with the bright and naive meta-narratives about progress and development than with the sense of an ending, both personal and epochal. Elizabeth Leidenson will be second, and the first to give a comment is a professor of French and comparative literature at Columbia. Her main teaching and research interests are in 19th and 20th century French and comparative literature, gender studies, cultural history, and historiography. She is the author of Proust Lesbianism and Dirt for Art's Sake, Books on Trial from Madame Bovary to Lolita, both from Cornell University Press. Charlie Coleman is a professor of history here at Columbia, whose work explores the intersections between theology, philosophy, and political economy during the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution. He is the author of The Virtues of Abandon, an anti-individualist history of the French Enlightenment, which was awarded the Wiley Prize in French Cultural Studies, and The Spirit of French Capitalism, Economic Theology in the Age of Enlightenment, both books from Stanford, which was shortlisted for the Kensher Prize. His current projects include a number of new projects, include a sequel to The Spirit of French Capitalism, tentatively titled Money and Martyrs, that extends the history of economic theology to debates over ecclesiastical property, paper currency, civil religion, and social rights during the French Revolution. He is also writing the volume on the Enlightenment, the Oxford History of Political Thought, along with, as though that were not enough, a more specialized monograph on Rousseau. And last but not least, Deirdre Lynch is Harvard College professor and the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of Literature in the Department of English at Harvard University. She is the author of Loving Literature, A Cultural History, and The Economy of Character, Novels, Market Culture, and the Business of Inner Meaning, both from Chicago. Most of our panelists are very loyal to their presses. She is also the editor of several books, including the unfinished book, Oxford 21st Century Approaches to Literature, The Romantic Period, which is a volume of the Northern Anthology of English Literature, and an annotated edition of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming and celebrating Joanna, who will begin by saying a few words about her book.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you to my esteemed and beloved colleagues who are here to start this discussion of the book. And thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Asking people to come out on a chilly evening in mid-November to talk about a book about death and nothingness is a big ask. So I'm going to hope to leave you with something, a few things, and not just with nothing. And I'm going to do so through a couple of images from the book, among other things. The basic premise of this book is that we tend to think of the Enlightenment as forward-looking. We think of it in terms of what it led to, whether we see that positively or negatively, as the case may be. And what I wanted to do was to flip that question on its head and not think about the Enlightenment in terms of what it led to in the future, but looking back through the eyes of the men and women who participated in the Enlightenment and see things as they saw things, casting a retrospective glance over their lives and over their life's work. So that's sort of the starting point for the book. What would the Enlightenment look like if we looked at it through that perspective? And the answers that I came up with, I didn't start with any answers, but the answers that I found were somewhat surprising, to me at least. What we find, less than an idealistic view of human progress or optimism, confidence, is an emphasis on the fragility and transience of human life and an effort to capture that in writing, an emphasis on nothingness and silence, and making a space through writing for nothingness and silence. So it's a very different view, I think, than some of the standard accounts of the Enlightenment, which doesn't mean that the standard accounts are wrong, but it's really a different aspect of the Enlightenment that I was trying to call attention to. So that's where I start. So I want to, by looking at a few of the images from the book, give you a sense of some of the characters, the people, the writers who are featured in this book. This is a page from one of the herbaria, collections of dried flowers and plants that Jean-Jacques Rousseau compiled and made himself over the course of his life, and in particular at the end of his life. This one is from 1772. He would die in 1778, 6 years later. He is back in Paris doing botanical expeditions on the outskirts of Paris, writing the Reveries of the Solitary Walker and compiling these herbaria. And one of the things that I really love about this image is its fragility, its modesty, the white space around the flower, the simplicity. Rousseau is looking in the Reveries of the Solitary Walker to write in a way that is equivalent to this flower, and he compares his ailing body. His senses are declining, he's aging, he knows that he is dying. He writes about the fact that he is preparing for death. And he tries to write in a way that captures that fragility of his body and that contemplation of death. The last fragment of the Reveries of the Solitary Walker is unfinished. It's a textual fragment, just as this is a plant or flower fragment. And it cuts off at a very particular moment. That could be because Rousseau died and didn't have time to finish writing it, but the moment that he cuts off that text is very particular and very interesting in a way that makes me think it opens out onto silence after his death. So now I need to figure out how to use this clicker. I did want to give you, one of my regrets in the book is that I did not include the original French in most of my quotations. So I did want to give you a sense for the beauty of the language of one of the writers who is featured very centrally in my book and who is the least known. This is a woman named Madame du Deffand, who was one of these salon hostesses who welcomed the famous philosophers into her living room, served them dinner, played cards with them, told them jokes, talked about literature with them. She was in a correspondence with Voltaire, and then throughout much of both of their lives, and then with the English man of letters, Horace Walpole. And in the two final chapters of the book, I look at her correspondence with Voltaire, and then at her correspondence with Walpole. So let me just I was planning to read this, but now I realize that it is behind me. Votre dernière lettre, dont vous ne vous souvenez sûrement pas, est charmante. Vous me dites que vous voulez que je vous fasse part de mes réflexions. Ah, monsieur, que me demandez-vous? Elle se borne à une seule. Elle est bien triste. C'est qu'il n'y a, à le bien prendre, qu'un seul malheur dans la vie, qui est celui d'être né. Il n'y a aucun état, tel qu'il puisse être, qui me paraisse préférable au néant, nothingness. Et vous-même, qui êtes Monsieur de Voltaire, nom qui renferme tous les genres de bonheur, réputation, considération, célébrité, tous les préservatifs contre l'ennui, trouvant en vous toutes sortes de ressources, une philosophie bien entendue, qui vous a fait prévoir que le bien était nécessaire dans la vieillesse, eh bien, monsieur, malgré tous ces avantages, il vaudrait mieux n'être pas né, par la raison qu'il faut mourir, qu'on en a la certitude et que la nature y répugne si fort que tous les hommes sont comme le bûcheron. This is a reference to a fable by La Fontaine where the bûcheron calls on death and asks to die, and then once death gets there, he says, no, 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 help me put the wood back on my shoulders. So she's has a very bleak philosophy of human existence, and this letter was written in response to Voltaire asking her to share her philosophy, which he said is going to be better than all of the famous philosophers out there. I want to hear your philosophy, and this is what she sent him. So he answers with a joke. The punchline takes a week to get there, but here is one of the things he says in response. Ce n'est pas que le néant n'est du bon, mais je crois qu'il est impossible d'aimer véritablement le néant, malgré ses bonnes qualités. So this is one of the things I love, is that there's this starkness, this confrontation with death, and at the same time, this 18th century wit in response to it. And we find this in Hume as well, who was very funny on the subject of his own death. So one of the things that I argue in the book, and I think for me this is the thing that I really feel that I discovered in a certain sense, is that Madame du Deffand influenced Voltaire. So he's going to respond with some platitudes, with some jokes, with some witticisms to her philosophy of death. But then in his last two poems, written very close to his own death, notably the last one, he actually grapples with her philosophy of nothingness and with the possibility that even he, the great Voltaire, will not be remembered shortly after his death. This poem exists only in two manuscripts in Voltaire's hand, and one of them is at the Pierpont Morgan Library. I had the great fortune to be able to, it's a single page, a folded page, so 3 sides of paper, and I had the great fortune to be able to hold it in my hands and to study it, which I felt was the moment when I sort of got the closest to what my topic really was, in a certain sense. So one of the things that was striking to me and that you don't see in printed editions of the poem is the blank space. So this left-hand facing page is not the end of the poem, and yet there is this dash, and then there's blank space. There's no reason for that necessarily. And then we have the actual end of the poem with this more curly dash underneath it. The word néant, or nothingness, is repeated on both of these pages. And I just wanted to give you, I'm pushing the wrong button, a detail. If you see the little tiny word under the crossed out line, le néant. It's the tiniest word on the page and it's nearly illegible. So that was something that interested me just in studying this manuscript. And then I just want to give you a little sense of the poem. So the poem is called Adieu. Farewell to this life. These are the last lines of the poem. Petit papillon d'un moment, invisible marionnette, qui volait si rapidement de Polichinelle au néant. Dites-moi donc ce que vous êtes. And so rapidement rhymes with néant, and there's an acceleration in the rhyme at that moment. The poem ends with a question. What are we? If we flitter from Polichinelle to nothingness, from being a sort of marionette on the world stage to nothing, what are we? And there's no question mark, whereas Voltaire did use question marks at other points in the poem. So it seems that there's some sort of decision to leave a certain suspension at the end of this poem, despite the curlicue that suggests that this is a finished work. This is Madame du Deffand, who was having this correspondence with Voltaire. She was blind. She went blind at the age of 50, so for much of the part of her life that I'm writing about, she was blind. While she was hosting multiple people in her salons and, again, playing cards with them, telling witticisms, etc. What I find, this is the most often reproduced portrait of her, of which there are not many. What I find so beautiful in it is that she was obsessed with nothingness. This was her philosophy of human existence, and she appears to be holding nothingness in her hands, contemplating it, not through her eyes because she's blind, but by holding it in her hands. It's a very beautiful image, and I do want to give homage to the young woman who designed the cover on the basis of that image. I just learned that it was actually her first cover design. So I was really moved by how she managed to capture the spirit of the book by doing something with that image that Yale originally did not want to use. And she found a way. I pushed to have them use it, and she found a way to make it really meaningful. And many people have said how much they like the cover. And so I've conveyed those thanks to her. There should be one more image. This is the last image I'll leave you with. This is something that was very meaningful to me. It's an object that is at the Walpole Library at Yale in Farmington. And this was a snuff box that a friend of Madame du Deffand's gave her with a wax portrait of her dog, her beloved but very ill-behaved dog who was always biting people and ruining furniture, named Tonton. So she bequeathed this to Horace Walpole, who was her great love and had a deep friendship upon her death. She also bequeathed all of her papers to him and the dog himself. And Walpole took care of the papers, ensured that they were eventually published, while also ordering that his letters be destroyed. So we have a kind of reverse of the typical situation where the woman's letters are lost and the man's letters are preserved. Here we have Madame du Deffand's letters, thanks to Walpole. And he also took very good care of the dog, which was no easy task. So what I find moving about this object is that it's a wax sculpture of the dog. Madame du Deffand would have never been able to see this wax sculpture. It has a glass case over it, so presumably she wouldn't have been able to touch it either, nor would she have been able to see the dog's supplicating gesture. She would have had to touch his paw in order to know that he's holding his paw up. So there's a sort of muteness in the gesture that I find very beautiful. So this was my chosen image for the cover, but Yale said, that doesn't make any sense. People are going to think it's a book about dogs, so you can't do that. So thank you, and I really look forward to hearing what you all have to say and discussing the book with you all.
Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I have to say that I am in no way a specialist of the Enlightenment, and so my remarks will not be specialist remarks, but rather some sort of aleatory remarks about aspects of this book that I really appreciated, that I found absolutely fascinating. But first, I want to talk about the sort of the margins of it. I mean, I have to say that writing books is very difficult, it seems to me. I mean, I think that even Antoine Compagnon might agree with that. I'm not sure. It is. I mean, he pops them out constantly, but it's still kind of difficult. And this one, though, must have been tremendously difficult in ways that I can barely imagine, because, I mean, first of all, yeah, it's not really a sprightly topic. And second of all, I mean, the in memoriam list and the first sentences of the prologue demonstrate the extent to which there were problems. I mean, this must have been a tremendously, I caught glimpses of it, but I mean, really quite, this book is fraught in ways that most books can escape being. So I wanted to just mention that. And I also think that as a result, you could probably write another book about the writing of this book, I would suspect. And I'm not sure, well, it would, I'm not sure you'd want to, but you could. Okay, well, I basically would like, just in the few minutes that are allotted to me, I would like to talk about just some things that really struck me in this book. And one of them, and I'm going to conclude with Madame du Deffand, actually, with whom I feel a particular connection. But first of all, I just pulled out a few moments from the book. One that I just thought was really amazing from the Buffon chapter. You say, so on page 38, it is here that Buffon develops his physiological theory of death as a slow process of ossification, whereby the bones and fibers, as soon as they are no longer susceptible to growth, become increasingly dense and gradually lose their liquidity and ductility. And then you cite Buffon, I quote, The membranes become cartilaginous, the cartilage becomes bony, the bones become more solid, all the fibers harden, the skin dries out, wrinkles form little by little, the hair turns white, the teeth fall out, the face loses its shape, the body becomes stooped, etc. And then you comment, close quote, you comment, this account of aging and death with its charming and terrible, etc., was by no means entirely original. And I just thought the charming and terrible, etc., it was like a little rainbow had appeared on the page. I just thought that was amazing, and my hat is off to you for that, charming and terrible, etc. Because yeah, reading it, that sentence almost killed me. By the time I got to the etc., I was really ready for a little rainbow to open up on the next page, and it did. So number 2, is the microphone okay? Yeah, okay. Didn't know whether I was shouting inappropriately. Okay, the next thing is also about Buffon. Let's see, so Buffon died on April 16, 1788, attended by Necker and his household servant, Marie-Madeleine Blesseau. After his death, an autopsy performed on his body revealed 57 stones in the bladder and left kidney, weighing altogether some 84 grams, which is pretty impressive. As was customary at the time, these stones were distributed as keepsakes to a number of Buffon's acquaintances, including the co-author of the quadruped volumes, Daubenton, who's also got a metro station to his name. This was a strangely fitting way to commemorate the naturalist, etc. I thought, now that's something we don't do. Like you don't, and in fact, I mean, I have to say that my sister-in-law, many years ago, my sister-in-law, who had a gallstone, a very impressive gallstone removed, forced me to admire it. And that almost killed me also. It was enduringly traumatic, so traumatic, in fact, that I learned how to say gallbladder in French, and still vésicule biliaire was my knowledge of the phrase was the fruit of that unfortunate event. But I think this is just so amazing that they handed out his stones as keepsakes, and it's just this is one of the phenomena that mark the past as not like now, like really not like now. Okay, moving right along. I was in a book about the late 18th century. I was not surprised to find decapitations, but I was surprised to find tapeworms. Sorry, that went wrong. I was surprised to find tapeworms. In fact, there's a rhetorical tapeworm when Madame du Deffand likens the experience of ennui to a tapeworm. But there's also an endnote in which you remarkably cite a scientific, I guess, contemporary to us, scientific experiment in which tapeworms were decapitated, and then something happened that I didn't really understand.
Their memory.
But okay, first of all, how can you tell what a tapeworm is remembering is one thing that I'm wondering. But also, I just didn't expect to find this many tapeworms in your book, is all I want to say. So my fourth observation of this sort is in fact, it was about the dog. I wanted to know what had happened to the dog, because I don't think that because I kept thinking, like, he was in England, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. So how did that work? I mean, do you know how this? Because you repeatedly mentioned that she bequeathed her papers and the dog to him, and I was thinking, how did that work, and what happened afterwards? So
There's the quarantine and everything.
yes, I was wondering about that exactly. I guess they were
see if I can-
less worried about rabies. Can you?
Yeah, I've become more attentive to the real world as I was writing this book, like material, actual how things happen. I do know that the dog was transported to England. I don't know how or under what circumstances. I also know that once Walpole was taking care of the dog, he kept on having to, he was a very sociable man. He kept on having to rush home early because the dog was home destroying furniture. So he, and he kept, in his diary, you can find, or he had a sort of notebook where he kept important events in his life, and the death of the dog features prominently. So he was a devoted caretaker to the dog.
My other question about this dog is: was Tonton a name for uncle at the time? Was his dog named Uncle?
I assumed, but I didn't ask myself that
question. Okay, enough about Tonton, I guess. Okay, finally, Madame du Deffand. I have to say that. So I wrote my dissertation on Proust and Madame de Sévigné, and both the cause and the effect of this was that I became enduringly obsessed with all matters epistolary, which led me to Madame du Deffand and her correspondence with Horace Walpole, in particular, and. My discovery of Madame du Deffand, her correspondence with Horace Walpole, who, as everyone knows, was in fact the pioneer of Gothic fiction with The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. Among other professional activities, political and literary. I was so fascinated by Madame du Deffand's passionate letters to the somewhat horrified Horace Walpole, who was 20 years younger than her, and did not. He described her. Oh my God, where did I wrote this down? He described her when he first met her as. I can't find it.
Aging blind wit or something like that.
Yeah. Where is it? I can't read my own handwriting. Sorry about that. Oh yes, sorry. Thank you. Thanks very much. A blind old woman, a debauchee of the mind.
Ah, nice.
Or a debauchee of mind, with whom I supped last night. That was when he first met her. This is quoted by Sainte-Beuve. And so, my obsession, my brief, it almost derailed my entire dissertation, and I almost veered off into the 18th century. And aren't we glad that didn't happen? But in any case, this led me. So, as a Proustian, of course, I had a professional deformation of contempt for Sainte-Beuve. But in fact, Sainte-Beuve has all sorts of interesting things to say, and among others, about Madame du Deffand, about whom he said. You quote this, I think. He said, Madame du Deffand est avec Voltaire dans la prose le classique le plus pur de cette époque, sans même en accepter aucun des grands écrivains. So that she was the most pure classic of that era, along with Voltaire in prose, and Sainte-Beuve's essay is quite lengthy and very interesting. And he says, and I know that I don't have any more time, but I'll just say that he compares her to Madame de Sévigné, a comparison that, she does bear comparison with Madame de Sévigné, a comparison that she refused to acknowledge had any validity to it. But what Sainte-Beuve remarks, and I think this is really very accurate, he says she's not quite at the level of Madame de Sévigné, less verve, not the same sense of detail, but also he says something interesting, which is not just about the literary, but about the fact that Madame de Sévigné had this sort of uncategorizable passion for her daughter, and that her daughter's letters have not survived. I mean, there is a big parallel to be made, and also, and so that Madame du Deffand's passion for Horace Walpole, and whose letters don't survive, and Madame de Sévigné's passion for her daughter, whose letters don't survive, and the reticence on the part of the beloveds in both cases, and the uncategorizability, I think Saint-Beuve says something like that about it, it does certainly bear, right, he says, in fact, if we pardon Madame de Sévigné, this is an old translation, if we pardon Madame de Sévigné for having loved her daughter to idolatry, we must also pardon Madame du Deffand for having felt for Walpole a passion one knows not how to qualify, which entered through her mind into her heart and was fervent, lofty, and pure. So basically, I think you should write a book about Madame du Deffand and Walpole, and if you don't, maybe I will. That's all I have to say. Oh, no, wait. There's one other thing I have to say, which is that reading your book made me rethink the history of ennui, which in my 19e way I had really misunderstood. And I think it's Madame du Deffand's take on nothingness, and her insistence that nothingness, that ennui is a foretaste of nothingness, the nothingness of death, and that death is preferable to the nothingness of death is preferable to the nothingness of life, is absolutely fascinating and needs to be thought about. That's it.
Thank you.
So am I audible? Okay, whether I'm intelligible remains to be seen. So in 1791, the National Assembly voted to rechristen the Church of Sainte-Geneviève in Paris as the Panthéon, or Pantheon. In May of that year, the architectural theorist Antoine Quatremer de Quincy published a report addressed to the departmental government on how to prepare the building for its new purpose. As he put it, the fatherland is a new divinity for a free people, one that required an altar around which its worshippers bind themselves in the ties of fraternity. This altar was destined for, in Quincy's words, the homage that the fatherland renders to great men, homage that should be led by children of a common mother. Despite the gendered political language of the time, the patrie, or fatherland, also presumed a maternal presence. No women were destined for the new pantheon. The first woman to be pantheonized for her own merits was Marie Curie in 1995, more than 2 centuries after Voltaire's and Rousseau's remains were transferred to the National Temple. As Professor Stalnaker remarks, one of the designs of her new book is to restore women to their place in the French Enlightenment, to construct, as it were, a historical and literary monument to their neglected memory. The Rest is Silence is not only a book about the 18th century Enlightenment, it is also truly and deeply an enlightened book for our present. I cannot hope to do it justice in our scant time together. I will instead gesture toward paths that Joanna's work illuminates but does not fully explore. This virtual dialogue will extend from The Rest is Silence to books by Antoine Lilti and Dan Edelstein discussed at previous events in this series, and we'll touch upon among other subjects, the life and death of the Enlightenment as a movement and its rebirth as a political project during the French Revolution. The first theme I'd like to address, suitably enough, is death itself. Not only physical death, but those moments in the lives of sentient beings when their consciousness seems suspended or even annihilated. Joanna mobilizes this context in her brilliant chapter on Diderot, which argues that his late work develops a materialist understanding of death as the dissolution of one body into others. Indeed, Joanna shows how Diderot performed this dissolution in the literary style of Éléments de physiologie, with its assemblage of fragmentary thoughts threatening to evaporate into the symbolic ether. The third part of that book, on the human brain, observes how consciousness is repeatedly interrupted even in our waking moments. Given this all too punctual experience, Diderot proposed that existence of an immense or total memory must register those lapses not only within a single mind, but also across minds in moments of enchanting diversion. I could not help but recall that such preoccupations did not begin in Diderot's later life. They were already apparent in his Encyclopédie articles on distraction and dreams, both of which suggest that the self constitutes at once a thinking subject and an object that could be dispossessed. He addressed similar themes in the entry délicieux, or delightful, describing a semi-conscious state in which the self experiences, in his words, the sweetness of its existence without being attached to it, without reflecting upon it. Diderot further stated that, and I quote, "If one could attach to this delightful quietism the idea of immutability, one would form the greatest and purest happiness that humankind could imagine." This illusion was far from innocent for 18th century readers. Quietism referred almost exclusively to descriptions of the heterodox doctrines professed by the mystic Jean-Marie Guyon and defended by her acolyte François de Fénelon. The so-called quietist affair of the 1690s not only led to Guyon's imprisonment and Fénelon's exile, but also captivated King Louis XIV, Pope Innocent XII, and much of the French ecclesiastical establishment. Given Guyon's role as spiritual mentor to the author of Télémaque, one of the most influential and best-selling works of the French Enlightenment, it is surprising that Joanna mentions her only briefly, in an allusion to Voltaire's belief in an all-powerful but merciful God. Yet Voltaire also ridiculed Guyon in his Age of Louis XIV as, in his words, a woman without credibility, without real sense, cursed with an overheated imagination. My aim in tracing the genealogy linking radical mysticism and radical materialism is to suggest that Joanna's approach might pass too lightly over religious antecedents and influences. My first question, then, is why she made this interpretive decision and whether she could be persuaded to take those antecedents and influences more seriously. Guyon was no philosophe, even if Fénelon would posthumously be counted as one. But the radical spirituality they professed assumed new meanings in the hands of Diderot, who adapted the language of quietist dispossession to experiment with alternatives to the autonomous, self-owning subject commonly associated with the Enlightenment, alternatives that allowed him to ponder the revelatory pleasures to be gained from self-loss. In so doing, he formulated a materialist interpretation of dreams, according to which nature, rather than God, operates as the totalizing force that dictates the existence of all things. From this perspective, Joanna's claim that, in her words, the quintessentially Enlightenment question was how to die as a non-believer requires, in my view, further nuance. If, as Joanna argues, Madame de Deffand grappled with this question at greater length because she was an outlier, then why hold her up as an exemplar? This is my second question. After all, Enlightenment philosophers aimed at minimizing the significance of death. Of Joanna's other case studies, Buffon's and Rousseau's deistic faith remained intact, and Deffand reported that Voltaire had repented on his deathbed. Only she and Diderot died as convinced atheists, but the latter showed how traditional divinity was not the only conception worthy of belief. These observations bring me to another related question. Must the modernity of the 18th century Enlightenment be the same as our own? In other words, what of historical difference? Joanna seems to endorse Jonathan Israel's understanding of the Enlightenment as a crucible of secular democratic ideals. A host of scholars, including Antoine Lilti, have challenged Israel's approach, which reduces the Enlightenment to a kind of dogmatic orthodoxy. Time does not allow me to convey my own deep reservations, except to note that Diderot's appropriation of quietism suggests that the French Enlightenment evinced religious influences where historians like Israel have found them most lacking, in its radical materialist atheistic wing. It is for this reason that, like both Lilti and Dina Goodman, I define the Enlightenment not as a set of fixed doctrines, but as an intellectual movement animated by the spirit of critique. What the philosophe aspired to could only be grasped by confronting and passing through its opposite, which is precisely why the dialogue fostered by the Salon was so crucial. The objects of their aspirations remained radically open, and in this way, the Enlightenment encompassed myriad ideals that became touchstones for antithetical traditions devised in the 19th and 20th centuries, from liberalism to Marxism-Leninism. Even if I take issue with the claim that dying as an unbeliever was the quintessential question of the Enlightenment, I agree with Joanna that Deffand and her fellow Salonier figured centrally in the Enlightenment along the lines I have just sketched, and as philosophes in their own right. But her book compels us to contend not only with the deaths of individuals, but also with the fate of the Enlightenment as an open-ended movement rather than as a prescriptive project. Joanna seems to demur from answering the question of how or when the Enlightenment died. My last question then is whether she would consider speculating on this point further. For my part, I read her as implying that the Enlightenment passed away with the philosophes and saloniers of the 18th century. Roger Chartier once claimed that it was not the Enlightenment that gave rise to the French Revolution. Rather, the revolutionaries invented the Enlightenment as a means of granting themselves historical legitimacy. Joanna's work suggests that this formulation is not quite accurate. After all, if the philosophes viewed their thought as a break with the past, then this operation also posited a break with the future. The 18th century Enlightenment met its end in 1789. The revolutionaries transformed what had been an open-ended movement into a political project that depended more on fixed binaries than on critical oscillations. Thus, to pronounce the death of the historical Enlightenment becomes a paradoxical means of redeeming it, above all from anachronistic projections that cast the movement as the original sin of modernity. It is for this reason that I embrace Joanna's approach over the claims made by both Lilti, who seeks to extend the 18th century Enlightenment into the present, and with Edelstein, who conflates Voltaire's anti-pluralist cultural program of enlightened despotism with the terror launched by radical Jacobins during the Revolution. The rest is silence and joins us to return to the Enlightenment of the 18th century, when philosophes and saloniers engaged in an array of thought experiments, both verbal and written, including those that presume their own obsolescence. This Enlightenment is over, and the rest is silence serves as a fitting elegy. Its remains are to be found not in a pantheon, hastily and retroactively constructed, but scattered like ashes across the leaves of literature and philosophy.
I'm just going to improvise a bit to say I am just delighted to be here. I am the real interloper since I'm a scholar of 18th century British literature, but this book spoke to me in remarkable ways, and I'm just going to try to give you a feel for how it did that. So, as you've heard, the Rest is Silence is a book about last things and last words. And it is also about how things do and do not last. Professor Stalnaker's achievements also include, I'm going to be proposing, all that she contributes to our understanding of 18th century media theory. Her book's originality lies in part in how it brings death studies into a new conversation with a field that we might call book studies. In my time tonight, I'll aim to show how reading Professor Stalnaker's book, one learns about books themselves and their place in an 18th century media ecology that had come to be organized around what, influenced by the musicologist Fabio Morabito, I have learned to call bookkeeping. This is a term that Fabio coined to register early modern Europe's growing interest both in the keeping of books, as in, for example, legal deposit libraries like the Bodleian or the British Museum, and in the keeping by books and in books, which is to say books' preservative powers, their much vaunted ways of outlasting their authors. Through its orientation to posterity, the Enlightenment might perhaps be seen as pioneering, in its accounts of the printed book in particular, the fantasy of a backup system, as we might say, a system that would be indestructible by virtue of both its diffuseness and its redundancy. We might go to David Hume's treatise of human nature from 1739 for an example, and The Rest is Silence has a prologue about David Hume, whose passing was sort of the talk of Europe. His Stoic passing was the talk of Stoic and infidel passing was the talk of Europe. Anyways, I have in mind a passage in the Treatise of Human Nature about how plausibility survives skepticism. And this is a passage in which Hume gives a remarkable explanation of why he and his mid-18th century contemporaries might securely believe that centuries earlier, Julius Caesar had been killed in the Senate House on the Ides of March, rather than, say, having died in his bed. How can we be sure about that? Hume asks. That belief, Hume writes, is anchored at first in readers' sensory encounter with certain letters and characters on the page of a history book, and beyond that, in their trust in the, and this is a quote, fidelity of printers and copyists, their confidence, that is, in the way that, again I quote, one edition passes into another, and that into a third, and so on, till we come to that volume we peruse at present. In Hume's account, the materiality of the printed page, in combination with the mechanical regularity with which the press multiplies such pages, works to mitigate our skepticism. It's a very strange passage. The Rest is Silence complicates that kind of book boosting, in part by looking closely at writing that remains or has been made to remain outside the boundaries of the Codex. One of my favorite parts of this book is the inventive close work Professor Stalnaker does with the manuscript remains of her authors, their letters particularly, but not exclusively. And I think here, for instance, of something that she just reminded us of, the fine-grained analysis she gives us of the particular way that Voltaire arranges his poem Adieu à la vie on his manuscript page, using the blank space, writing, or is it drawing dashes? Through her close work with this manuscript material, Professor Stalnaker makes us aware of the limitations of the book as a medium. In this case, the aspects of Voltaire's poem that are not represented or maybe even representable in the printed editions of his works. Some things, uh, some things that cannot easily be kept in books, notwithstanding the 18th century confidence in bookkeeping, might be the very experiences of impermanence and transience that the philosophe found so compelling, as Professor Stalnaker teaches us. The Rest is Silence thus gives us a view of the philosophe thinking about those limitations and thinking too about how the Codex might be reconceived to be more accountable to those experiences. Here I'm thinking about the chapter centered on Rousseau's Reveries, whose pages Rousseau likens to a herbarium collection of plant fragments, ghosts of plants, like the one that you saw on the screen in Joanna's first slide, disintegrating fluid in both senses of that term. My own research on scraps in and out of books in the 18th century, which has sometimes been research on literal loose leaves, has often disclosed to me a cognate desire in this period for a book that might be, as it were, more loosely bound than is the norm. In this era, scrapbooking could represent another experiment in archiving what is fugitive without divesting it of its fugitivity. This gets me pretty naturally to my other favorite part of The Rest is Silence, which is the amazing account we get in its final third of a philosophe who was never an author, who had no wish, she said, to be remembered by posterity, Madame du Deffand. In Stalnaker's account, Deffand comes to view as the most radical of Enlightenment philosophers, who faces death more squarely than any of her male counterparts. She also comes to view, correspondingly, as someone estranged from the book and the permanence and posthumous life that media format promised. 18th century women of letters generally had every reason to anticipate their words not being lodged between the covers of bound printed books, but in the best case scenario, consigned instead to the diminished inchoate category of family papers. And that's a term that I've always found incredibly fascinating. At a particularly thrilling point in Professor Stalnaker's portrait of Madame du Deffand, we hear about the feminine handicrafts, knotting, effeuillage that she practiced in her salon. And effeuillage, I learned from The Rest is Silence, is a practice of unweaving cloth, a practice then of unmaking. As Professor Stalnaker comments with respect to these handicrafts, these arts of impermanence, what more poignant metaphor could we find for the ephemerality of great swaths of the female intellectual life of the Enlightenment? Women, David Hume said chivalrously in the middle of the 18th century, were the sovereigns of the empire of conversation. But of course, the oral practices of the queenly salonière that Hume praised have left few traces. One more achievement of this splendid book is that it forces its 21st century readers to grapple with their inheritance of that loss.
You want to respond?
So should I try to respond? Thank you so much to all three of you. There's so many different things that I would want to say and books that I would want to write in response to what you've said. Elizabeth, I would like to write the books that you have suggested that either you or I could write.
Not the first one.
No. I had sort of, you started by saying you're an interloper, but I had sort of forgotten about the extent to which, the Sévigné connection and how, your interest in Madame du Deffand. So I was really thrilled to hear you talk about that. I think Sainte-Beuve is amazing. He was somebody who I wrote about in my first book, who was just picking up on these strange texts in the 18th century, whether it be by women or whether it be the descriptive poets that I looked at in my first book, and really offering extremely interesting and thought-provoking interpretations of them. So I'd kind of like to revisit him and the 18th century and do more with that. I really appreciated what you said about ennui in terms of, her making you think about it in a completely different way. I didn't really have a sense of sort of where ennui is going in the 19th century, so I wasn't conscious of that.
Right, you point out. I mean,
Yeah, do I really? Okay. Thank you for reminding me of that. In any case, I mean, one of the things I wanted to emphasize with this phrase, so she calls ennui, which was her other obsession besides nothingness, she dreaded it greatly, un avant-goût du néant, a foretaste of nothingness. And so what interested me about that was that it's the materiality of it. She calls it a taste. She's an empiricist. It's sensual or sensorial in some way. And yet it's a foretaste of something that is the absence of all senses in death. And, this was a problem that many writers of this period reflected on. Hume is very interested in the intermittence of our selfhood, whether it be through sleep or whether it be in death. And there's some real interesting relationship there between Hume and Deffand, even though she did not admire him a great deal. Charlie, very hard questions, which I welcome. And would I be willing, or would I want to consider some of the religious antecedents? Yes, I would. I think that would be a good place to start for rethinking sort of the narrative of the book as a whole. I think that oversight on my part, I mean, first of all, I think I could have benefited, obviously your work influenced me, but I could have benefited by engaging more directly with it throughout the book. I think that this sort of oversight, if you will, or lapsus about, sort of religious antecedents or spiritual antecedents is kind of revealing of maybe the deepest personal origin of the book, which is I come from a family of atheist philosophers and was raised in that tradition. And I also come from a family where talking about death is taboo. So of course, then I have to gather a bunch of people in a room and talk about it. And one of the great things about publishing this book, not that many people have read it yet, but so far my family has, and we're having a lot of conversations about death and nothingness that we would not have had. So I think my preoccupation with the atheism and the materialism might have been less because that's how I think, that's the quintessential question of the Enlightenment. You quoted me, so I said that, so that's not inaccurate. But I think that might be coming more from sort of my own preoccupations with what does it mean to die if as a non-believer? And I think that was a question that Defoe in particular was very preoccupied with. We always have things that we don't like about the things that we produce in life. And I would say that I struggled a lot with the conclusion to this book. So there's an epilogue on Madame Roland, the revolutionary. She's kind of offered as a counterexample because she dies shortly after the figures in the book, but at the age of 40 instead of in her 70s or 80s. She's imprisoned and guillotined as a member of the Girondins. And so she's writing her memoirs in prison, and she's rushing to sort of save her name and reputation for posterity. And so I took that as a sort of counterexample to this giving up of one's reputation, giving up of one's name. But I feel that I didn't really grapple with the question of the relationship between the Enlightenment and the Revolution in a way that, the questions that you're asking really would oblige me to. And I like what you opened with about the Pantheon, which is something that the students in my What's Left of Enlightenment seminar, we opened the class with talking about a piece of street art, a portrait of Rousseau outside the Pantheon, sort of unsettling the question of Rousseau as a great man inside the Pantheon and rather Rousseau out on the street. So I would like to think more about that. And certainly the late inclusion of women in the Pantheon is very interesting, as you said. Deidre, it's just been wonderful to, over the past year, to hear you speak about your Scraps project at Fordham. That was a fantastic talk and really inspired me. I did not, as I said earlier, I'm not somebody who has tended in the past to focus on material culture. So in my first book, I think I was very ignorant of sort of like the actual physical side of things. And partly through the topic of this book and partly through my emphasis on the materiality of the body and the physiological processes of death, I became more interested in the paper and the pages and them being outside of books. And so I really want to, as you know, I worked at the Walpole Library on Defoe's archive, and there I was looking at a lot of random little scraps of paper. And you and I have also talked just today, but also previously about the question of women's writing and the way that the narrative, how we think about the book in relation to other forms of writing, or even if it is a book, a many-handed book. So one of the books that I looked at in Defoe's archive at the Walpole is a collection of letters that she had her secretary, since she could write aided with some sort of device, but with great difficulty. So she had a secretary who did most of her writing for her, and she made a collection of sort of the best letters or the most important letters to her from her salon. And so it's not her writing, but it's her book. It's her sort of composition. It's many-handed in a certain sense. And for my future work, I really want to continue moving in that direction to think about how we can build on Dina Goodman's work on the salons and on women's letter writing, but focus more on this sort of question of the relationship to the book and literary style and sort of collective authorship. So I hope to pursue that conversation with you and that project.
All right. Well, I will take advantage for 2 minutes before handing it over to questions and answers to sort of ride on Joanna's coattails to point something out that strikes me also. I mean, there's about 100 to 120 people maybe in this room. There's 4 literary critics at this table. I think that's quite unusual. And there's one aspect that was not yet been mentioned, which is the style that Joanna studies, but also the style in which it is written. So the book also presents itself quite literally, and I quote, as a case for a former literary approach to the Enlightenment. So it's a kind of a manifesto for literary criticism. And she adds, one of the most distinctive features of the Enlightenment philosophy more generally is its attention to the resources of language and dialogue. Philosophical ideas are forged in dialogue and embodied in concrete forms, and we must attend closely to those forms, the philosophical dialogue, the letter, the rêverie, the collection of fragments, if we are to grasp the ideas themselves. I believe that you not only do that in the book, but that the book itself is written with painstaking attention to the form that it itself adopts. And it's a beautifully written, highly accessible, jargon-free book that I think deserves to be read by all 100 or 120 people in the room. So I will open it up now for your questions, and maybe we can take a few at a time because there's a lot of you, so that then you can either direct them to Joanne or any of the specific panelists or to the entire panel. Yes, go ahead.
I think it was a reference to religion that made me think this. I mean, 'cause it's such a negative way of looking at life, and where's the joy in living? I mean, it's all very negative, isn't it? And how pervasive was that, do you think?
And I only gave you one quotation. Imagine if you had read all of the letters. Yeah, it's funny. My father said to me in reaction to this, I couldn't quite figure out your heroine. She seemed like kind of a bore, going on about how awful her life is, and yet she was esteemed as this great wit. So how does that work? How widespread was it? I haven't come across anyone like her. I think she's pretty extreme in that light. But I do think Charlie's questions have made me think about one of the things that I was sort of didn't really answer that has come up in some of my conversations when I was working on the book was, where does her concept of nothingness come from, if she gives it so much importance? So maybe some of the religious antecedents or spiritual antecedents would help me to kind of address that question. But I don't see it as being tremendously widespread. Although, I guess what I would say is I end with her because, as Deidre said, I consider her to be the most radical, just in the sense of pushing that confrontation to its kind of limit. But I also feel that the others went in that direction in some ways, that they sort of considered the possibility. So a typical line about the Enlightenment is that these philosophers replaced, it was a famous argument by Carl Becker in 1932 or something, that they replaced the afterlife with the idea of posterity. And he quotes Diderot. Diderot says that. So, that's very much true. But then they question it also. So even Hume, in his last self-portrait that he writes right before he dies, when he knows he's dying of intestinal cancer, he is talking about his rising reputation and how his books are going to be remembered. But I sort of try to show that he's also kind of undermining that or questioning that at the same time. So they might not be as bleak as her, but they are entertaining the possibility that they will not have a lasting legacy.
There's a question over here and over here.
Thank you for doing this. This has been absolutely stimulating. So thank everyone on the. I'm curious about the place of relationships in the talk about nothingness and death. I'm curious particularly about these philosophers and how their relationships may have influenced their perspective on nothingness. It seems very apparent at the start that when Voltaire reached out to Madame du Deffand about her ideas, she said she'd rather not write them. It's because it's best to have died rather than to have lived. And however, she sort of suggests something of continuity when she bequeaths her dog to Walpole. So I don't know if maybe she had a better relationship with Walpole than Voltaire, and hence the suggestion of continuity. But I'm curious about how these philosophers and their relationships with others may have influenced their, I don't know how dire the sense of nothingness and death may have been.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great way to think about it. I would say that for her, those human exchanges were everything. So Elizabeth, you were asking sort of where's the joy or where's the life? She was very negative even on those exchanges. Nonetheless, she engaged in them, and that was how she lived her life. She thought of them as ephemeral, and her last gesture, so I write about this in the last chapter of the book, is to write a letter to Walpole that is crafted as a final farewell, and it's a letter about friendship. So there is really an emphasis on that as sort of all that her life has been. Because she did not have children, she did not. But as you say, she bequeathed the papers, so that complicates. Sort of my line is she didn't want to be remembered, and she says that. But obviously, the gesture of bequeathing the papers kind of goes against that to some extent. But that's part of the reason that I emphasize the dog, because bequeathing your papers doesn't necessarily mean you want them to be preserved. Maybe it's just that relationship that she wanted him to have the papers until he died. She didn't give any instructions about the publication of the letters. So I think the relationship is central. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been a remarkable panel, and it's a remarkable book. And I'm so glad you raised the word style, because I wanted to ask you a question about style. The book is just brimming with these incredibly brilliant ideas, but it's also really powerfully and movingly written. So the style in the book is doing a lot of work, but it's also doing a lot of work for the different thinkers. And so I just wanted to ask you, you do such a brilliant job of articulating the ways these different formal aspects of the text get kind of looped into the conceptions of both death and what will go on beyond, right? The fragment, the dialogue. But where does style fall in there? Because Buffon is famous for his style. Defoe says she has no style, right, and compares herself. Roland is very insistent on style. And I guess I'm thinking about the fact that style is something, right? Ideas can be expressed by different people. They can be decanted into different texts. They have a kind of perdurability that's of a different order from style, which is particular to a person, right? To there's a kind of mortality to style, I guess.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to ask where that falls, both in the context of your different thinkers, but also just within this book, which is asking style to do a lot of different kinds of things that are really powerful and really moving.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. I don't know, your question's making me think sort of about the AI world that we're living in and the things being automatically translated, people not wanting to write for themselves anymore. I may have so Buffon's famous definition of style was le style c'est l'homme même, style is man himself. I have what I would say is perhaps a very naive conception of style. For me, I read a sentence of Virginia Woolf and I know it's Virginia Woolf, and it's a certain body and it's a certain person, it's a certain worldview. It's not just individual, it carries a culture, it carries, a language, but it's also her. And I don't know if that's a sort of naive, both in the sense that it's a sort of trans-historical understanding of style, but that's how I think of style. I don't know if I really, that's one of my regrets for the book is I don't keep the original French. And so, it's my translation. So when you translate someone like Defoe, I don't know if you got a sense of it just from that one quotation, but I just think that the style of her sentences, I wouldn't be able to characterize it better than that, but I would like to be able to characterize it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess I'm thinking a lot about everyone's talking about this now, but I'm just kind of preoccupied right now with the idea that we're trying to sort of do away with everything human in every way, and so in a way, I wasn't thinking about this when I was writing the book because I've been working on it for 15 years. So AI was kind of at a very different place 15 years ago. That's also the funny, Elizabeth, the passage from Buffon that you quoted. I started this book 15 years ago, so I was, significantly younger at that time and in better bodily shape, let's say. Also hadn't had brain surgery. And so that passage was one that I read at a couple different talks when I was first kind of, and people would they would say, oh, that passage is so horrible, but also, why are you working on this? Like, why? You don't have to be doing this. Anyway,
That thought crossed my mind.
Well, I think that my husband will attest to the fact that that thought often crossed both of our minds over the last 15 years, especially one summer when, I was quite sick myself but didn't know it, and I got out of the library all these big 1,000-page French thèses d'état about the history of death, and that was my summer reading, was like 5 books on the history of death. Anyway, I feel that I've kind of gotten away from style, but I guess the point is, just right now, some of my students are here, of course, beloved colleagues and friends, being in a room together. For me right now, being in the classroom together and just having a small piece of text that we're all looking at together at the same time, that has become intensely meaningful. And for the first time the other day, there was a little piece in Columbia News about the book, and I found myself saying, in answer to a question, I'm a teacher. And I thought, I've never said that before, but I feel for the first time in my life kind of like a teacher, like that's really what I want to be doing. And it's partly about being in the classroom, looking at the style of individual writers and not trying to deny the fact that they are actually people who are behind those texts, along with a lot of other stuff.
Thank you. I think this is a really unique approach that I've never heard of before, that or considered that their death or illness would give a feeling of terminating their great ideas. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, or that they didn't have this aha moment of how great this is, or think that they were so pessimistic of the fate of their ideas, is rather unusual. I've never heard of that before. And we look at events of history, particularly I'll give one approach, which is Christ. Father, why have thou forsaken me? That was his one moment of pessimism, not stressed. And that was his triumph on the cross. Everyone who believes in him, even though he had a moment of hesitation about his ministry. Benjamin Franklin, this is the best we have, when he came out of the Continental Congress. I didn't think it was an aha moment. There's a lot of writing now about Watson. He doesn't have that feeling of being pessimistic about his aha moment. This is a great advancement in biology. So just given the history of ideas versus the events of life, I think we have to separate those two. And what are your thoughts about just this pessimism that we never heard about? We can go on and on. The Aesop, he never thought as a slave that his writings would never last. It's just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the book ends with this figure who is very pessimistic, but there are some other ways to think about it, possibly. So a writer like Rousseau shared the idea that the work wouldn't necessarily be preserved. So he wrote of his last work, The Reveries of the Solitary Walker, I'm not even looking to get this published. I'm not worried about the fate of these pages. So it's a work written for the self alone. At the same time, it's not just a private journal. And it's a literary masterpiece. So, where is the joy or where is the life? These textual fragments do remain, and that was very important to me to sort of focus on that. It tempers the pessimism in some ways.
Two questions.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you to the panelists. It's a beautiful book, super interesting commentaries from all your panelists. I want to return to joy a little bit. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I mean, I think there's the religious context that Charlie talks about that's really interesting and important. But maybe you could speak a little bit more about the kind of generative possibilities of nothingness, because I think what's so beautiful and interesting in your book is that it's not just about a pessimism, it's not just about a nothingness, and not just about silence, but there's an activity, and there's a generative possibility that is, I think, potentially scientific, and in thinking about things like spontaneous generation and other ways in which nothingness produces things. But clearly, in your work with the page, and in your work with your analysis of your different authors, and in Diderot in particular, there's a sense that nothingness is a much more again, generative and poetic space than something that is something that we should mourn.
So it's not nihilistic in a
No.
certain sense. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say that there may be a sense growing out of that silence that you're leaving some space for others to come after you, which is a very positive. It's not looking towards the future, but it's just acknowledging that it's time. You've passed through your life, and they're influenced by stoicism. But in terms of the generative possibilities of that blankness, I feel like I'm referring too much to Rousseau, but that final fragment, so he writes about a moment of happiness with his lover, Madame de Warrens, and that happiness is, when they were in nature together, is sort of symbolized by a single flower that he comes across on one of his botanical expeditions. That's the other flower in addition to the one that I showed you, a periwinkle flower. So he's, in his last words, he's writing about that period of happiness with her and his debts to her that he could never repay. And right at the moment when he's deciding, I need to go to Paris in order to become a writer and therefore, be able to pay my debts to Madame de Warrens, that's where he breaks off. So the entire sort of unhappiness of his life, as he would put it, as an author, is not written about. And so that leaves, if we take your idea that the blankness is a kind of generative space, he stops with the happiness and allows us to just kind of meditate on it. And it gets back to what you had asked about relationships, because that is about happiness that comes from a certain very fragile, ephemeral relationship. And the woman has died by the time he's writing the Reveries, but he's remembering her, and he's remembering a debt to her that he would only be able to pay sort of across the barrier between life and death.
I'm intrigued by your concept of nothingness, because in my naive understanding, it falls somewhere in the middle of this sort of Buddhist concept of nothingness, right? Which is an ideal. That's the nirvana. And then the Nietzschean concept of, where man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. So these are the context in which I've understood the concept of nothingness, right? And if you can just place maybe the concept you spoke about in terms of these two very divergent concepts.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And also, we ran into each other on the street, and you've been here for the whole series. I really appreciate that. Buddhism has been coming up in questions that people have asked me a couple of different times. Notably, there's a student newspaper called The Gadfly, and a first-year student who's taking a French course and is also interested in philosophy, read my book, interviewed me, asked the most probing questions, and one of them was about Eastern influences. So I've started to try to figure out, I told her, what I would want to do is kind of approach that historically, see what, Voltaire was extremely interested in these ideas and writes about them. So I don't know enough yet to be able to answer that side of the question in a historic. I also don't know enough about Buddhism, but I would like to know more. But I would want to sort of go back and see what they were reading and sort of how ideas are circulating. As far as Nietzsche, I'll have to think about that side of the equation more, but thank you for giving me the suggestion.
Thank you for this beautiful panel, and I look forward to reading your book, Joanna.
Thank you.
I also want to talk about nothingness, and I think the term Madame de Dufont is using is néant. So I guess I want to think about it from coming from the 17th century, speaking of Madame de Sévigné, 17th century, and thinking of le vide et le néant. And is there a connection about experimentation on the void, on the vacuum, and so the vacuum and nihil? Is that maybe somewhere that's coming from there? And what about air, if that is the case?
Yeah.
Because I think about salon culture and description of les airs galants in the 17th century, like air and the ephemeral nature of conversation that we lose into. So is there something about air, vacuums, voids, nothingness? Are they connected, or I think your thoughts on those? Thank you.
That's a great question. As you know, there's been a tremendous amount of work in the history of science on the question of the void in this period. I mean, in the earlier period that you work on, and then moving into the 18th century. When you say air, so I was thinking you meant air, like air, but then the air de galant, etc. Are they the same? Like, is that where the word comes from for air galant? They're connected. Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that, and I'll have to think more about that, but one of the things that really struck me in, it was actually one of the anonymous readers for the book, said that there's a sort of material, it's the tapeworm, there's a material nothingness, because Dufont compares ennui to a tapeworm. So it's basically sort of destroying you from the inside. So it's a very physical, material image in order to get at this experience that is in some sense immaterial. And so that was one of the reasons that I kept on sort of playing around with the idea of her as a materialist, because I think she is sort of trying to find these material ways to talk about things that are ineffable in a certain sense, and maybe thinking about air and, le vide. I had not thought about that when I was writing about nothingness, but maybe that would help to be able to move us in the direction of a more concrete, scientifically grounded, maybe getting back to what Andrew was asking about as well, scientifically grounded way of thinking about nothingness. And then put that into the mix with quietude and the religious. Like, it's going to be definitely another book.
We'll maybe take one more question.
So, thank you all, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, John.
So I'm gathering from the discussions that there's a uniqueness about the fact that these thinkers all recorded their thoughts at this moment of their lives. And my question is about that uniqueness, because sometimes we think it's unique simply because there's no record of anyone else doing it. And
right.
One of my questions is, are there any parallels? I mean, is it just because nothing was ever preserved in other places, other cultures where things might have been written at this stage of life with this reflective kind of inward-looking thinking? Or is it that this group of thinkers, this group of people, because of the Enlightenment, because of who they were, because of the time, were just a unique happenstance? Was there something inherent in the way they were thinking that generated it?
Yeah, I mean, I would guess, I would say two things to that. I don't think it necessarily is a unique phenomenon. I'm sure it happened in other times and places in various different forms, but maybe the kind of particular, one of the things that I was interested in was it's the last decade of the old regime. So things are going to change a lot. They die, Hume dies in 76, Buffon dies in 1788, right before the French Revolution. His son will be guillotined during the Revolution. So they don't know that big changes are afoot. But nonetheless, they do have a sense of the end of an era because of the fact that they work together as a republic of letters, as a Société de gens de lettres, a society of men of letters in the Encyclopedia Project and other collective projects of the time. So that means that their sense of a generation and a generation coming to an end is particularly accentuated. So you sort of combine that with the atheism, so contemplating really what it means when you don't have the afterlife to rely on, all of those factors sort of make it a somewhat unique situation, which doesn't mean that other people were not writing in this way. So we haven't said anything about Montaigne, but I start in the introduction, or part of the introduction is about Montaigne's essays, which we have worked on together in the core mini class, one of my favorite works. And he was really a model for them in terms of writing right up until the death and kind of reflecting on death. And one of the interesting things about the evolution of the essays, I remember going to my mother when I was in graduate school and saying, when I was reading Montaigne and saying, Mom, do you think we should just think about death all the time? You know, and she changed the subject because no, one should not. But by the end of his life, he did not think we should think about death all the time. He had really changed his view. And it's like death is not the goal of life. You know, it's the end, but it's not the goal. C'est le bout, ce n'est pas le but. And so that evolution, but he wants to sort of document his own death in writing. And so, and the descent into nothingness. And so Diderot has an interesting moment where he borrows a sentence from Montaigne's essays, but kind of rewrites it in a way that changes the meaning of it for his own sort of philosophy. So yeah, it's worth thinking about how this compares to other moments and cultures. And thank you.
I'm sure we could continue for a very long time. I also don't think it happens every night that you walk away from La Maison Française excited about tapeworms. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and especially a warm, congratulations to Joanna for her book. Speaking of material books, it is also for sale with a small discount.